Hello and welcome to the Actual Magician's Bookshelf. Yes, I am an actual magician, and we are going to be covering in episode 27 another letter from Magick Without Tears by Aleister Crowley, and this is one of the letters towards the back of the book, and it is letter 81, which is on method of training. It's only a short letter. It's 4 pages long. And that's just literally a very short letter, but it is really important, and I wanted to cover it before we go any further into some of the other content in Magick Without Tears. Now, one of the main things that this is about is the differences between yoga and magic, yoga and occultism, but we're not going to dive really deeply into that. I just want to cover it as Crowley is making the point about it. There are other books that I would recommend to discuss this difference, the best of which is Paul Brunton's book called The Hidden Teachings Beyond Yoga. The Hidden Teachings Beyond Yoga. And that makes a similar point that Crowley is making in this method of training in letter 81. And we're also going to look in Magic and Magic in Theory and Practice. We are going to look at a ritual or a methodology in here called Liber Thisharb, which is Bereshith backwards, and I'll explain what that is very shortly, and why it's important and why it's referenced in this letter that we're going to look at in Magick Without Tears. So without further ado, let's take a look at what Crowley is saying here. And again, he's responding to things that the student has written, that the student is asking about, and so forth. Sorry, I've just been distracted by my familiar Jeff, the sparrowhawk, who is busy circling the sky above the fields and mountains, doing his last hunting of the day. So, Karasora, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. The first and absolutely essential task for the aspirant is to write their magical record. And I've already done another video on the importance of writing a magical journal, a magical record, and Crowley is coming back to that all the way as he concludes his letters in Magick Without Tears. Really vital element of one's work is constructing the magical journal or magical diary. And to shortcut what we're going to be covering today, Crowley is really leading to the point that without knowing from where you have come, without knowing your entire history in a esoteric and magical sense, you cannot divine your purpose, or it's harder to divine your purpose and your progress, which we're going to look at in another video, in Western Esotericism in your actual life. And Crowley is really going back to the importance of one's true will, aligning with one's existent true will. We are always doing exactly what we are doing. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law is a future tense. It's not do what thou wilt is right now the whole of the law. Is do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, because will is impelling us into a future, but will is constantly present, constantly congruent, constantly consistent, and constantly comprehensive, because it is reality as it is right now, and it cannot be anything else. So when we are asking, in this case, the aspirant to write their magical record, we're doing it for a very specific purpose. It's very useful, very essential, and it saves a lot of time in the long run. So he starts off with, you know some elementary mechanics, the triangle of forces and all that. Well, if we have a body acted on by 2 equal forces, one pulling it east, the other south, it will tend to move in a southeasterly direction. But if the south force is, say, twice as strong, it will move south of southeast. Now, you, sitting in your study reading this letter or listening to this video, got there and were compelled to do that as a result of the impact upon you of countless quintillions of forces of every kind. I don't expect you to discover all these and calculate and report them, but I want you to set down all of the main currents, for so you should be able to get some sort of answer to this question. Where do we go from here, boys? And basically, that's what the magical journal is all about, and what one's magical memory is all about. It is constructing and aligning and recognizing and integrating all of the key essential aspects of one's life so that one can chart a straight line forwards and not be at odds with one's actual history, one's actual experience, one's actual actual karma, in the sense of all of the consequences of one's actions in the past. And in Crowley's case, we're talking about past lifetimes as well, in order to not fight against that. I always say that true will and so forth is like the tiller in a ship. It's at the back. We look to where we want to go, but we steer in reverse by moving the tiller at the back of the ship. And integrating, say, through counselling, through therapy, which is an essential part of Western Esotericism, as I teach it at least, is an important stage in building together a map and model of one's true experience, one's true life, one's true karma, one's true duty, one's true consequences, in order to progress forwards as well. And this is the method of training that we're talking about here. One other way of doing it, of course, is through astrology or through dream work, through just pure counselling and so forth. But here we're looking at it in a more general aspect. So he goes on to say, I'm not a guesser, and I cannot judge you or advise you or help you unless and until I know the facts as thoroughly as you are able to allow me to do. The construction of this record is, incidentally, the first step in the practice called samasati, and leads to the acquisition of the magical memory, or the memory of your previous incarnations. So there is another reason, terrifically cogent, for writing this magical record as clearly and as fully as you can. And then he mentions the best explanation of how to set about the task is given in Liber Thisharb. So let's just cut to that while we're here. So in Magick, or Magick in Theory and Practice, this is in Appendix 7, which relates to the Chariot as a tarot card, as a major arcana, is Liber Thisharb. And basically it's spelt with the Hebrew letters B-R-A-S-H-I-T-H, which is Beth, Resh, Aleph, Shin, Yod, Tau, and that's Bereshith backwards. And Bereshith means in the beginning, which is the first word in the Bible, which starts with a B and not an A, of which there are many Kabbalistic books written about that just in itself. Why is the first letter in the Bible a B and not an A? Because it's the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. But anyhow, so in the beginning is spelt backwards to make Thisharb. So it's a meaningless word, but it is Bereshith backwards. And it's because the whole method, and there are sort of two main methods in this, and a sort of summary as to the method, is basically working backwards. It's training the brain to work backwards. And so, for example, here he says the first method, let the exempt adept, which is Hesed on the tree of life. And so we are just before the abyss in the initiatory system at this point, and this is why it's also taught at that grade. It's in order to collate the entirety of one's existence before, in effect, releasing it into the experience of what we would call the abyss. So let the exempt adept, exempt because we are now exempt of all expectation and necessity, first train themselves to think backwards by external means, as set forth here following. Let him or her learn to write backwards with either hand, walk backwards, constantly watch films backwards, reversed. Let him practice speaking backwards, thus for I am he, let him say E ma I. Let them learn to read backwards and devise other methods to do so as well, because as an exempt adept, you've already gone through being a adeptus major and therefore coming up with your own magical system entirely. So at this point, Crowley is saying that you should be able to work it out yourselves, unique methods for yourself. And the one I used was actually from the second method that he gives, which is basically tracing one's experience in real time while sitting in an asana, a yoga position, and every thought that comes to mind, everything that's around you, everywhere where your attention goes, you immediately go backwards as to why is that thing there? Did I buy it? Was it given to me as a gift? When did I buy it? How did it arrive? What is it made of? Where the things that it was made of, where did they come from? Which factory was it made in? Why was the factory even built in the first place? Was it a factory belonging to a family? Where did that family come from? How did they travel from one place to another? What is their entire genealogy? And you trace everything back as far as you can to its source. And I would practice it by watching the news. This is many years ago. I was practicing Liber Thisharb, and I would watch the news and I would try and work out the limits of my knowledge as far as why in that country is this happening? Why is the politics that way that I'm watching on the news? What is the history of that entire country? What is its geological history? And you try and trace it back all the way as far as you can. And you're basically training the mind to be in a state of complete recognition of living history, the living past. After a while, and Crowley mentions this, that I think he says something like, in this his brain will be at first overwhelmed with a sense of utter confusion. Secondly, and it does, it will endeavour to evade the difficulty by a trick. The brain will pretend to be working backwards when it is merely normal. It is difficult to describe the nature of the trick, but it will be quite obvious to anyone who has done the practices and for a day or two. They become quite easy and he will think he is making progress, an illusion which close analysis will dispel. So basically, Crowley is saying that sometimes you trick your own brain into thinking you're reading backwards or you're doing something as best you can, when in fact your brain is just trying to take a shortcut to it, say, oh, well, it's all dissolved into the past and that's all I can do with it in my mind. But after a while of practice, it's not that you are expanding your knowledge of history. It's not that you're expanding your knowledge of consequence or your own past and all of the influences on your own past. The brain starts to naturally gear itself into a different state. And this is where, as I teach it, the Western Esoteric Initiatory system is, I think, different to just doing practices, just doing things. It's more important to understand how the state change happens. And all of these things, they're just content, they are just rungs on the ladder. And when you get to where the ladder is taking you, you do not need the ladder. There are too many people clinging onto the rungs of the ladder saying, this is what I'm going to teach you. This is where you need to be. This is where you need to go. This is where I am, and so forth. And it's only a ladder. It's not important other than as a rung in terms of state change. And with Liber Thisharb, one of the state changes, the major one, is that you start to look at everything as a I think there's a scene in the film Lucy with Scarlett Johansson, and she has this experience because of this brain enhancing drug that is flowing through her body of the cinematography is like everything is going backwards and she's just flipping things backwards, and she flips things backwards in her perception, going all the way back to primitive humankind and so forth. And the way it's done with these flipping things where everything runs backwards is literally how the brain starts to run on Liber Thisharb when practiced consistently, congruently and comprehensively with everything. You start to look at everything and perceive everything as the entire consequence of existence happening in real time with you, in front of you, in co-creation with you, and you realize you are part of that as well. And it's a phenomenal experience. It is a overwhelming experience, and it takes a while for the brain to start to adjust to it. And then, because it really knocks behavior, this is one of the other things with state changes and initiations on the Tree of Life, it knocks your behavior so far that quite often it's difficult to impossible to work out initially how you're going to change your behavior, your speech, your values, your beliefs, and so forth from the state change. Initiation and state change is wildly, wildly impactful on everything in your life, and this is why it is so important to have a system in order to navigate the consequences of each of the grades, each of the step changes, because they are so wildly influential and important, and they cannot be pretended. They cannot be pretended because you have no interest in pretending anything, because you're dealing with the consequences of what has just happened as a result of the initiation or state change that you are experiencing. And Liber Thisharb is a major one, and it is just below the abyss on the Tree of Life in the grade system. But you can practice it in a smaller way at any grade, at any stage of your progress. It's just a lot of methods are really better suited once you've done other things below them. I think Liber Thisharb, for example, is really good to understand the hidden teaching beyond yoga, the consequences of that. It's really good to understand yoga, meditation, both physical and mental yoga, as in yoking to attention, and the way the mind works, and also understanding things like logic and common sense and Are You Thinking Clearly, a book my son recently recommended to me because I'm interested in books about thinking itself, and this is an interesting book. I've not started it yet, but my son very kindly said, oh, this is a book that's right up your street. So I bought a copy just recently, and all of those things act as then a foundation to doing something like Liber Thisharb. And if you haven't already done a load of work in keeping a magical journal, as Crowley is recommending, then a lot of that work is going to be less effective, let's say, or less impactful than it might be done at the right stage. So he goes on to say, some of this sounds rather advanced and technical, but it ought to give you the general idea. You should begin with your parents and the family traditions, the circumstances of your birth and education, your social position, your financial situation, your physique, health, illnesses, your vita sexualis, your sex life, your hobbies and amusements, what you are good at, what you are not, how you have become interested in the great work, and how you have come to this particular point. For example, the point of watching this video, how have you got here? Why did you decide on this video and not another video? And all of the history leading up to that very point. That by itself helps you to understand yourself and me to understand you. And from that point, the keeping of the record is quite easy. All that you then have to do is put down what practices you mean to begin, how you get on with them from day to day, and as he is saying, at intervals, what I've got to say about your progress. So Crowley was making notes on people's progress, and often did. He would make notes on their magical diary and return the diary to them. And this was one of the ways I was taught when I was a young magician as well, by having notes written on my personal diaries. So he then goes on to say, that is all about the magical record. The way is now clear to set forth our method. And this is method in the big sense, not as in a particular technique. Liber Thisharb is full of a few methods or techniques, but Crowley is talking about the method in its biggest sense. This is twofold: yoga, introversion, and magic, extroversion. Yoga, introversion, magic, extroversion. These are rough but useful connotations. The two seem at first glance to be opposed, but when you have advanced a little in both, you find the concentration learnt in yoga is of immense use in attaining the mental powers necessary in magic. On the other hand, the discipline of magic is of the greatest service in yoga. And this is the entire point of Paul Brunton's The Hidden Teaching Beyond Yoga. As a sort of Western mystic, he studied yoga very deeply, practiced it, and then was led to the conclusion that once you have attained the yogic state, what do you then do? What do you then do from that state? It is not just, and even yoga itself admits to this, it is not just about attaining a state. It is not just about being able to sit in a particular asana for however many hours it may be. Once you have done all of that, what is it preparation for? What is it leading you to be able to do, or want to do, or revealing to you to do? And this is the point Crowley is making here. Let me remark, by the way, that to my mind, one of the greatest beauties and most encouraging confirmations of the validity of our system is the matchless harmony of its elements. Always when we pursue any one path to its end, we find that it has become one with some other path which at the outset appeared utterly irreconcilable with it. And he goes on to mention good ways to study yoga. Now, obviously, this is quite dated now, because Crowley was one of the people who really introduced and encouraged yoga into the West. There's been a recent academic book written about that, about how he and Alan Bennett, for example, really brought a lot of Buddhism and Eastern teachings to the West, and how there's another good couple of books about how yoga really came into the West as well, and is to some extent parallel to the Western esoteric and history tradition, but in Crowley's view, entirely intrinsic with it as well, threaded with it. So he talks about Book 4, Part 1, which is in Magick, which has got a lot of yoga to it, his 8 lectures on yoga, and then the Raja Yoga book as well. So those are the books he recommends on yoga. Perhaps I'll do another video at some point with some good books on yoga from a Western esoteric and history system perspective as well. But Crowley's work on yoga is quite interesting and is good historically to appreciate and understand. And then on magic, he says Book 4, Parts 2 and 3, Magic in Theory and Practice, and Book 4, Part 4, The Equinox of the Gods, add the Book of Thoth, and there you are. Of other writers, and he basically says you've got the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin and the works of Eliphas Levi, and that's all. He doesn't recommend anyone else other than himself, Eliphas Levi and the Abramelin, for understanding magic. And of course now, almost 100 years later, we've got a whole wealth of magic materials to hand. And in my short videos, I've done a lot of recommendations of my favourite or recommended books on each subject within the whole corpus of Western Esotericism, and you can find over 300 of those there as well. But ask if you've got any questions about a particular book, about a particular subject or a particular stage or a particular question or area of interest, and I'll see if I can recommend you a book from my experience anyway. And so he goes on to say, it may help if I try to expound the essence of these two methods in very simple language and very different language. And he goes on, the process of analysing, developing and controlling the mind is the essence of all yoga practices. Again, for that, see Paul Brunton, The Hidden Teachings Beyond Yoga. Magic, on the other hand, explores and learns to control these regions of nature which lie beyond the objects of sense. Reaching the highest parts of these regions, called the divine, one proceeds by the exaltation, intoxication, yes, of a sublime sort, of the consciousness to identify oneself with these celestial beings. In yoga, various practices prevent the body and its functions from interrupting the mental process, and then one stills the thoughts. In magic, on the contrary, one passes through the veil of the exterior world. One creates a subtle body called the body of light, which we looked at in the Magical Link video previously. This one develops and controls it, gains new powers as one progresses, usually by means of what is called initiation, the most important thing of all. Finally, one carries out almost one's whole life in this body of light, or in the sense of the Magical Link, which is the universe is now your temple, and achieves in its own way the mastery of the universe. So basically, both paths are the same. Both paths are identical. The first step in yoga is keep still. The first step in magic is travel beyond the world of the sentences. That is the whole business in a nutshell, and expressed so that anyone, however ignorant of the subject, may grasp the essentials, I hope. Love is the law, love and the will, yours for eternally, 666. So the first step in yoga is keep still, and to really go inwards, what he mentioned at the start of the letter about introversion. And now I'm being distracted by all of the jackdaws that are moving away from their work in the fields all day, and then they go and travel back to Dodd Wood, which is a bit further down the valley, and they sort of arrive in the morning and then they leave in the evening, all chattering to themselves. But yoga is an introversion. It is removal of the mental barriers to awareness, to pure awareness, to consciousness, by stilling the body in order to still the mind, and then that centers oneself, and then one expands one's awareness out of that. It's like contracted to a point, which means that everything is now in awareness. And then magic is sort of the opposite. Yoga is the introversion, the reduction to a singular point of awareness, making the whole universe our conscious experience by collapsing the universe inside so that there's no inside and outside. And magic is the expansion of our thought and being outwards, so that we then comprehend and in effect blow ourselves out into the universe, but whether through extraversion, so whether it's introversion or extraversion, it's basically arriving at the same point, whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. So Crowley is making the sense of there's two methods. Everything that we do, every technique that we do, is one of those two things. It is either a ritualistic centering of the self, or it is a ritualistic expansion of the self, but both go to the same point. And that's what he means by the method, by our method. It's not only as above, so below, it's as within, so without, but also as now, as ever. and this is where Liber Thisharb comes in. We can expand consciousness out or in. We can achieve unity in a lot of different ways, but there is also the sense of living in a temporal flow and using our magical memory and starting with a simple observation of causality in our life, that one thing leads to another. We are training our brain to recognize not just linear time, but the whole interconnection of an arising universe in an atemporal manner, in a non-causal manner, where everything is affecting everything else all of the time. Whether that was what your parents did in the war or what you did in a shop yesterday, that all of that is arising simultaneously in a universe that is existent in order to ask one question, which is, what is this? What is this? And the answer is Aie, the god name of Kether, the Ipsissimus at the top of the tree, which is I am that I am. Existence is existence. And all of these methods are to work outwards, work inwards, but get to that same point ultimately at the end of the day. So that was letter 81 of Magick Without Tears, which was on our method. And we might look at some of the method of training at least, and we might look at one of the penultimate letters as well, which is actually in a lot more detail. And then we're sort of shortcutting a lot of the details that Crowley gives in previous letters. The final few letters are basically Crowley's summation of his whole approach to everything, and written in the most clearest way he was able to. And that's why I think Magick Without Tears is one of Crowley's most important books to have whilst you read all of the other books. And we've seen that Liber Thisharb in Magic, or Magic in Theory and Practice, is an interesting exercise to develop what is called the magical memory. And perhaps we've seen how that is relevant to constructing one's awareness and state change, so that once one is in the state that everything is connected, everything is happening simultaneously, identity is just something that arises from a separation, that then when we remove that separation, ultimately, finally, we don't remove it. There's no we. There's nothing to remove it from because there's no division. But that collapse of state then produces what is known as the crossing of the abyss far later on in our mystical journey, that is now far more mystical than it is magical. So I hope that that gives you some interest in maybe doing an exercise in your magical journal or in your magical notes, or typing it up. Trace your family history, trace your own history, think about the places you've moved, think about the things that you've enjoyed doing, think about your failures, think about your successes. Have a look at maybe synthesizing all of that from your astrological chart. My friend and astrologer Lynn Birkbeck, and I'll put a link to his website below, can do you a very good chart report that will help you comprehend all of that in terms of your astrological CV, in terms of what your skill set is, where your opportunities are, and where your challenges will often arise based on looking at your life through your chart. And that can be a useful lens to really look at all of this as well and develop your magical memory. And then build on that into any past life work that you want to do. But however you see your past life work, always tie it to your current life work. Make sure that it is relevant to now. I was mentioning in the Philippines, where I was lucky enough to attend the TarotCon in the Philippines, and there's some stuff on our Facebook page about that. There was a brilliant talk by a young guy called Gabriel Thoth, and he was using an analogy of a VR game for discussing reincarnation and past lives. And he was using karma as the algorithm. So in a sense, karma is the algorithm of life. And I told him I was inspired by it, and I would definitely use that myself, but I would certainly credit him with the concept of it. And one of the interesting things with that is we were discussing it afterwards and online, and I said something like, well, I personally have never had any truck with past lives work. It's never really been my main concern or interest, reincarnation, past lives, and so on. It may have been the fact we were forced to study it for 2 double modules on the MA in Western Esotericism at the University of Exeter. We had to do 2 mandatory modules on Blavatsky, Alice Bailey, and Theosophy. And it was brain-crushing, absolutely brain-crushing. And if I wasn't interested in reincarnation and the secret chiefs and past lives and all of this before, then that just really crushed it out of me. But I said, well, it is interesting because in my actual experience, when I was younger, I used to be really obsessed with swimming. I wasn't necessarily very good at it. I did some gala swimming and stuff for school, but I just went into survival swimming. I did my bronze life-saving certificate as soon as I could, silver, gold, honours, and I was part of a little group of people where we were just obsessed with survival swimming. And I've even got a picture with me in the background in the newspaper because one of the girls in our little group was the youngest person in our country to actually get the honours survival certificate, and me and a couple of friends were just shortly after her as well. Just really obsessed with it. And I went to somebody for a reading at some point many, many years ago, maybe about 30 years ago. And out of the blue, and she didn't know me. It wasn't like it was someone I knew or someone who would know me. I think it was maybe a psychic fair or some similar circumstances to that. She could have had no knowledge of me whatsoever, absolutely none at all. She wouldn't have known even who I was, never mind pre-internet, how to check up on me or anything. But one of the first things she said in the past lives part of the reading, which I hadn't really asked for or anything, was that in a recent previous life, I had lost a child to a drowning accident. And it just struck me to the core that perhaps that's why in this life I'd become, even just like literally as I grew up, so obsessed with learning how to save a life, even though I wasn't training to be a lifeguard or anything. I wasn't going to be in situations where I was doing open water swimming with people. I was just obsessed with learning how to save someone's life in the water for the most of the early part of my life. And when that person said that to me from a past life, I thought, that makes sense. That helps me connect a narrative in my life. And that is useful perhaps to understand why I might have had that particular interest and how that is now built and how that attitude is part of my life and so on and so on and so on. And given it a wider context and part of an arising narrative that perhaps in a non-temporal and atemporal universe, in a causal universe where everything is connected, there's a resonance between that moment of a person losing their child to a drowning accident and a person apparently in the present moment learning to save lives by learning how to swim and do survival training and so forth. And there's some resonance between those two arising things in a not just sequential, but simultaneous universe. So I think those things are useful if they are helping change your state, change your awareness of the universe to make it more consistent, more congruent, and more comprehensive at all times. And this is what we aspire to in the Western Esoteric Industry System. So I hope that's given you some interest in going and having a look at Liber Thisharb in Magick, and having a look at letter 81 in Magick Without Tears by Aleister Crowley. And in our next video, we'll take a look at maybe one of the other summation letters towards the end of that sequence as well. But any specific questions, just drop them below and I'll be more than happy to answer them if I can. And until then, as ever, the worker is hidden in the workshop.